read the whole thing, but I would love to. Craig will put it online and you can read it yourself. Maybe I will read the whole thing. But Margaret Mead wrote for the first Earth Day in 1970 or 73, I don't remember which. Margaret Mead was a woman's woman. She wrote a series in Red Book magazine. You know, probably one of the most foremost anthropologists, and she's writing for popular culture. Okay. She wrote about how women's work is what is needed to, if we're going to save the planet, we have to understand what women understand about conservation, about conserving, about caring for the individual and caring for the community. That's not to say men don't do it, but as a culture, it's women that are on the ground in the mud doing this day after day after day. Now, women who are mothers and homemakers, please tell me if I've got this all wrong, because a lot of the guys here think I'm off the wall.
I 100% agree.
Who?
Can you read a little bit of Margaret?
Oh, I love Margaret. Margaret and Florence Nightingale are my favorite people.
Just encapsulate, just...
I'll take the second page.
And it was Margaret Mead, and while Eileen is, who really revolutionized the study of sex roles in human society, because she, as a young woman, went out into the field to the Pacific Islands, a number of them, and one of her many works was Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies. That was the name of the work. So her work on sex roles was really definitional in our understanding that we are acculturated in different ways depending upon our society. So she was in a real good position to do some comparing and contrasting around societies around the world in terms of sex roles.
So she called this talk, Margaret Mead on Care, well, I call it that, Earth Day and Our Plundered Planet, and she wrote it in the book, it was in Aspects of the Present, that's the name of the book, but it was called Earth Day and Our Plundered Planet. What we need beyond anything else is a frame of reference, a model for cherishing care for the earth and all human needs. Have we then another model? I believe we have. It is women's unremitting care for their families and homes. Age after age, women have learned to conserve, to plan for the next day and the next season, to use carefully whatever they had, and to keep a continual balance between giving and meeting the needs of everyone in the house, in the home. Women's conservative tendencies were born out of the limitations of the household, a small, closed universe. They have always had to think, so much food to lay away for the winter and the distant spring, so many mouths to feed each day. So then she goes, such a changeover from a focus on their own homes and their own small communities to concern for the whole world, in which their homes and families are included, involves long-range thinking and planning on the part of women together with men. It involves a process of self-education in knowledge we already have, and incorporating into this knowledge of attitudes toward protective care that women have not yet extended to the larger world. This is the first step towards partnership in decision-making that must be shared more equally by men and women for the safekeeping of the future. Shared responsibility for the protection of the planet is the goal we can best support with our belief that the world is a home for all mankind.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
When I said I 100% agree, that's, men are basically driven by ego. They're born with competition. It's forced on them their entire lives. Football, soccer, everything is competitive. I got to beat this guy. Women don't think that way. Most of them don't. There are those that do, of course. But that's the whole essence of the difference between men and women.
It's the difference between male culture and female culture. There is that.
I wouldn't say it's only culture. I think men are
Oh,
born.
it could be genetic too.
It's definitely part, I'm realizing our small flock of watching our animals and watching how they interact and watching the roosters. What they do is they're looking like this, and the chickens are scratching and the roosters are looking around. I mean, but what that goes to is that's their role, and this is sort of, how men perceive the world and how women perceive the world is different.
Mm-hmm. And all I'm saying is that the way women perceive the world is not part of the dominant culture. And what happens when women move into the dominant culture is they have to absorb.
Subsume.
No, absorb. Yeah,
Be more men than men.
that's right. They have to be more men. They have to take on, and then when they do, they're criticized for it.
Right.
So, and in many cultures, they're killed. I mean, everybody knows, well, and not to mention the fact that there are millions of women in this world that have their clitoris cut out of them at birth or at a young age because it is thought to cause them to become unfaithful. I mean, we're talking about
Faithful. Become faithful.
and unfaithful. Having a clitoris causes them to become unfaithful.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to challenge you here because I think the topics on the table are more than one. And no, let me clarify that. In other words, the discussion on care, moving on to clitorectomy, while an unbelievably painful and horrible practice, and I can speak ad nauseum about that, you're going to have to bring it back to care. My challenge to you is that because care kind of falls over the feminine, under the feminine role, it opens up all the doors to feminine oppression.
Well,
And so you're going to have to tie that back, otherwise it's becoming another issue.
it isn't a separate issue.
Well, you're going to have to clarify that.
Give me a minute and I'll be happy to clarify.
Go ahead.
The reason this is a critical issue is because if you think about the human population on this planet, of which we are about to have 9 billion.
7. We just
No,
got to 7.
We just got to 7 and the next turnover will be 9 billion. It is unsustainable. In every family in the world, there is a woman who is doing the same work every day. Taking care of children, taking care of the family. Yes, men do some of the work. As Margaret said that I didn't read, is the men that are most understanding of care are farmers, are men who do the farming and do the care of the land. If we are to survive, we are in a real dilemma, and here's the dilemma. The dilemma is that all over the world we have exported American culture. And as we all know, we've exported it to the poorest and most populous countries in the world, where we now have men and women, but women moving into roles where they're working, and they're still going home usually to take care of kids. But that is no longer their primary role. And so the dilemma on our planet is, how do we educate and expand the roles of women so that they become part of the economy, so that they're not always subservient? How do we make them equal without leaving women's work where we left it in the United States, which is basically done by menial workers and the poor and working class women? Most women of privilege don't do housework. They have servants.
You know,
The 1%.
men in the Western culture, European, the United States, Australia, I mean, we have an idea of the first world.
Yeah.
There is a burgeoning feeling that men are helping with the housework. Men
Yes.
are taking more
Oh, yeah.
privilege. They are getting points for that. They are no longer do we stare at a man who's got a baby carriage and he's sitting in a playground. So there is that coming on to the planet. And I agree with you that it's been researched well, that if you give money to the third world women, they will educate their children, vaccinate their children, but it's not true of the men. And I agree with you that we will not survive if we don't inculcate that care that women give, and men. So it's not just women, but men are have started to give that care. We've got to care for our families, we've got to care for our communities, we've got to tune into what is going on in the political situations, and what's happening with the planet. We have to do that, otherwise we will not survive.
Well, if you in the back first. And if you could speak loud, just so it can be picked up.
Sure. The conversation had me thinking in a new way about care. And it seems to me that part of what happened in the 60s is that care in some ways came into consciousness. That is to say, care is so important. It was almost a blind spot. It was the unlooked at. It was the taken for granted, sort of a bedrock, a grounding for everything. And what's happened is you kind of opened the door on caring and caretakers. And it's almost as if we don't have yet an inclusive vocabulary. And yet we're trying to parse what care means and how we can translate that to the bigger picture, to the planet, for instance, without losing our sense of what caring means as women come into a more assertive role that somehow redefines them as men and causes them then to have pressure to not do what they did before. There's a sort of turning going on. It's almost a terrible equivocation going back and forth. But in some ways, caring is so precious and sacred. It was perhaps almost unspoken of, and wasn't held in. I'm not saying it was held in that way, but there's a sense in which the heart knows. I mean, many women who've gone into therapy, say in the 60s and 70s, were asked, "Well, what do you do?" And they said nothing, and they looked at their day. And 99% of them were not the 1% who was hiring somebody to do their work. They were nurturing all day long. And somehow it didn't count. It wasn't accounted for. So there's something qualitative and quantitative. That's all of the dualisms are coming. And so there's now this awareness of the need for care. And the need for caretaking, and care for, and care about. Care is not a direct verb. It goes to an indirect object. So what is that? And it seems to me that we're redefining, and part of the perturbation in the field here is that it's not fully defined yet. And men who care so profoundly as to do what they do, can't be dismissed.
No.
And I feel it's partly in the language. It's not holding us.
Before Ken next, one thing that you said that for me, just in kind of reading the energy of it, if you say caretaking, it changes everything in the word caring. A farmer caretakes his flock. Somebody that is a forester caretakes the land or the garden. And you add caretaker, it could be any gender, any role. It's somebody, their spouse, it's a caretaker, their children. But you change it to care, and it somehow makes it much more sensitive. And somehow, it's an interesting, I noticed that I have no issues with the caretaking, and it's just pervasive and can be used in a million different perturbations. But then when it went to care, it has a hook somehow that